I'm concerned that a lot of instructors are simply sitting in the airplane, protecting the airplane while the student teaches himself how to fly. I've seen a lot of those, and that isn't professionalism at all. That's just building up flight time.
I look back on all my training as very positive, and I had the same instructor throughout all my training. He was very professional, he was very knowledgeable, he was always available to answer my questions, and even when I knew I was really screwing things up, he was always calm. He always, worked with me and talked me through, and I just felt really comfortable with everything that we did.
I think the instructor's primary responsibility is to teach people to learn to fly, to help them pick their way through the process without endangering themselves, the equipment, or the rest of us.
Well, I've had 2 separate flight instructors, and my experiences with all my flight training have been real positive.
So just what are an instructor's professional responsibilities? As you can see, there are a wide variety of responses to this question. The reason for this may arise from the fact that no 2 individuals have identical training experiences, and the relationship between each instructor and student is truly unique. However, another conclusion can be drawn from these diverse answers. Stated simply, a flight instructor has a wide variety of responsibilities. In contrast to other aviation professions, the responsibilities of the flight instructor are not as clearly defined. Our duties as flight instructors include the supervision and oversight of student training, providing authorization for student privileges, and recommending applicants for practical tests. All of these tasks must be accomplished in full compliance with regulatory requirements. However, our larger responsibility to the aviation community is to provide a positive example, promote safety, and teach good judgment and decision-making skills to our students. To help achieve this goal, we must keep up to date on regulations, procedures, and other training material as information is changed. Every aspect of flight training, from teaching primary students to advanced instruction, requires that a combination of unique responsibilities be met. Let's explore these professional responsibilities by examining some specific instructing situations. For example, a successful first solo flight requires the fulfillment of many responsibilities by both flight instructor and student.
It's interesting, in multi-engine training, we subject the student to all kinds of emergencies, but yet the average instructor will turn loose a student for first solo, first time in an airplane alone, without having drilled him in how to avoid the little mishaps that could occur, like going off the runway and tearing the airplane all up.
I just soloed and it was great.
I've had my A&P for over 4 years, and I've been working on airplanes for probably 10 years. Oh, absolutely. You can only hang around these things so long, before you want to fly them. I didn't hype him up on it, I guess you could say. So I just, when I thought he was ready, he soloed. Actually, it wasn't a big deal at all. He was really confident, and when he was ready to solo, he soloed. And as a matter of fact, he's one of the guys I work with. He's right over here. Rod, why don't you come over here? I'd like to tell you that I never told you this before, but you really did a good job.
Thanks.
The story we are about to relate concerns 2 student pilots who have reached the solo stage of their training. These scenarios will be used to provide valuable insight into the different ways in which professional responsibilities are met in any training situation. Meet Matt and Jennifer. Both of these students will solo for the first time today. But let's take a moment to examine just how well Matt and Jennifer are prepared for this momentous occasion. A bit of research into a student's flight training background can yield some interesting results. So let's take a look at how Jennifer's instructor, Steve, has supervised her training up to this point. When Jennifer first inquired about flying lessons, Steve recommended Advisory Circular 6112M, a student pilot guide that answers the questions most frequently asked by persons interested in flight training. This publication includes information about obtaining a medical and student pilot certificate, requirements for solo flights, endorsements, airman knowledge tests, practical tests, and flight training schools. Jennifer began assuming responsibility for her training from the first day. In addition to reviewing the student pilot guide, Jennifer promptly acquired all the necessary study materials, including a training syllabus which outlined the course of instruction. Other ways in which students share responsibility for training include scheduling lessons regularly, studying assigned material, asking questions for clarification of unclear subject areas, and being familiar with regulatory requirements. Steve understands the importance of meeting the regulatory training requirements prior to authorizing specific privileges such as solo flight. FAR 61.87 specifies the pre-solo aeronautical knowledge and flight training requirements. If the applicable regulation is not reviewed thoroughly, details in the requirements may be overlooked. For example, prior to solo flight in an airplane, a student must demonstrate proficiency performing go-arounds in various flight configurations, including turns, not only from final approach, but also from the landing flare. Another example is the forced landing procedure, which is routinely performed in the local practice area near suitable fields. However, prior to solo flight, students are required to demonstrate proficiency in forced landings initiated on takeoff, during initial climb, cruise, descent, and in the landing pattern. Some references in the regulations aren't as specific, stating only a general topic area. For example, emergency procedures and equipment malfunctions are listed as a flight training requirement prior to solo flight, but the particular procedures and equipment to be covered are determined by the instructor. A comprehensive knowledge of aircraft systems and the actions to take if an equipment malfunction occurs is essential for any pilot, regardless of the level of training. After a thorough ground lesson on aircraft systems, Jennifer's instructor, Steve, reinforced the proper procedures by repeatedly quizzing Jennifer during her flight training. The questions that Steve covered with Jennifer include: what is the significance of a zero indication on the suction gauge? What action should you take if the low voltage light illuminates in flight? What are the first indications of carburetor ice? In addition to the pre-solo flight training requirements, students must demonstrate satisfactory aeronautical knowledge of parts 61 and 91 of the regulations, and the flight characteristics and operating limitations of the make and model of aircraft to be flown. The demonstration of knowledge must include satisfactory completion of a written examination. Additional information concerning the contents of the test is contained in Advisory Circular 61101. According to this circular, the content and number of exam questions are determined by the flight instructor. The written exam developed by Steve contains questions covering the pre-solo requirements of FAR Part 61, and adequate sampling of general operating rules found in FAR Part 91, and specific operating characteristics of the Cessna 172. Steve also included questions specifically pertaining to the local flight environment, such as ATC frequencies, local airspace requirements, and the effects of density altitude on aircraft performance. The FAA recommends that a record of the written exam, including the date, name of the student, and the test results, be kept for at least 3 years. In addition, FAR 61.189 requires that each flight instructor retain for 3 years a record containing the name of each person whose logbook or student pilot certificate has been endorsed for solo flight privileges, and the name of each person certified to take a written, flight, or practical test. The endorsements in Jennifer's logbook and on her student pilot certificate indicate that Jennifer has received the required flight training and is competent to solo in a Cessna 172. Advisory Circular 6165C, Certification, Pilots and Flight Instructors, provides recommended examples of the required endorsements for all areas of training. While Jennifer meets the requirements for solo flight and has received the proper endorsements, a look at Matt's training background reveals that some important areas have been overlooked. Although Matt's instructor, Karen, briefly discussed crosswind takeoffs and landings during ground training, Matt was never exposed to any in-flight instruction in crosswind technique. Forced landing procedures were introduced early in Matt's training, but never practiced on a regular basis. Several months ago, Matt completed a ground school class at the local community college. Karen believes Matt's attendance in class provided sufficient ground instruction and that the final exam taken in class meets the pre-solo written exam requirement. Although Matt may have learned the appropriate information in class, the knowledge must be demonstrated by satisfactory completion of a written exam administered and graded by Karen prior to endorsing Matt's certificate for solo flight. It has been 2 weeks since Matt has flown, and Karen forgot to impress upon him the necessity of having his certificate available for the solo flight. Now Matt must rush home to retrieve it. While Matt is retrieving his certificate, let's check in on Jennifer again. Jennifer is procuring a weather briefing from flight service while Steve checks the weather from a computerized service. The forecast that Jennifer received and Steve confirmed indicates excellent weather conditions for a first solo flight with clear skies and winds from 170 at 5 knots. However, before the flight commences, Steve needs to discuss several issues with Jennifer. Defining procedures to be followed during the solo flight is one example of providing supervision and guidance during flight training. These procedures may include number of landings to be made, action to be taken if the wind increases or weather conditions deteriorate, and initiating go-arounds. Jennifer's flight is off to an excellent start. After 3 landings with Steve, the moment of truth arrives and Jennifer takes to the air in her first solo flight, while Steve oversees from the control tower. Meanwhile, Matt returns to the airport with his student pilot certificate in hand, 1 step closer to solo. Since the scheduled lesson time is running short, Karen instructs Matt to forego the weather briefing and hurry to the airplane. Little do Matt and Karen know, but the forecast has changed since Jennifer received a weather briefing earlier. A westerly wind is forecast to blow at 15 to 20 knots within the next hour. Returning from her successful solo flight, Jennifer shares the excitement with Steve. At the same time, Matt is completing a hurried pre-flight. After completion of 1 landing with Karen, Matt continues the flight solo. During the course of the flight, the wind shifts to the west at 15 knots. Matt is uncomfortable with the crosswind and unsure of what action to take. Concerned over the wind, Matt becomes distracted, leading to a high approach for his final landing. Instead of initiating a go-around, Matt touches down on the last third of the runway. Realizing his predicament, Matt applies heavy braking in an attempt to turn off at the nearest taxiway, and a flat spot on the right tire is the result. Of course, Karen could have intervened if she had been watching the solo from the tower. So, what conclusion can be drawn from these solo scenarios? The issues are more complex than whether Steve is a competent instructor and Karen is not. What can be concluded is that our responsibilities as instructors encompass many areas and extend well beyond the duties required of us in the cockpit. We must be aware of how our actions can profoundly affect a student's flying experience and shape that person's attitudes regarding safety of flight. For example, Jennifer's first solo was a positive experience, which will result in increased confidence during future solo flights. The additional trust and respect for Steve's authority will enable Jennifer to respond to instruction with greater assurance. On the other hand, Matt's confidence and motivation have been shaken as a result of his experience. Matt will feel uneasy about future solo flights, and his enthusiasm for learning to fly has been dampened. One final consequence of this event is that Matt will have to pay for a new tire. Now let's take a moment to explore the professional responsibilities involving judgment training, decision-making, and the examples we set for our students.
an instructor that has a casual approach towards anything, say weather, for instance, or pre-flight, the student has a tendency to follow the same suit.
If you have any questions, just give us a call here. There's always an instructor here that can talk to you and help you out with anything that you might need. Okay. Because I think that most of the instructors here do exercise really good judgment.
Yesterday evening, a private pilot with only 100 hours made a precautionary landing on a narrow dirt runway at a private airport. On a return flight from a business trip, the pilot, Kevin Smith, lost directional control during the landing and swerved off the runway into the grass. A witness recalled later that the pilot appeared to be having difficulty controlling the aircraft. Weather at the time of the incident was reported as marginal VFR due to incoming heavy thunderstorms. When the airplane was refueled this morning, 60 gallons was required to fill the 62-gallon tank. Now, moving on to the international scene.
What does this situation have to do with an instructor's responsibilities? Clearly, the pilot in command in this example made some poor decisions that led to this incident. What is not always clear is what we, as instructors, could have done during training to prevent a situation like this from happening. Our actions sometimes speak louder than words, especially when judgment and decision-making skills are involved. By examining the events that led to the incident on March 13th, we can explore our responsibility to set a positive example for our students and show how our actions during instruction can influence pilot judgment long after training is completed. One of the first elements that affected Kevin Smith's flight was a decision made regarding the weather. On the morning of the flight, Kevin was running late. The time was 7:30, already 1/2 hour past Kevin's planned departure time. Having obtained a computer printout of the forecast the night before, Kevin didn't bother to check the weather in the morning before his departure. Past experience may have had an impact on Kevin's decision-making process. Your influence as an instructor can discourage this type of poor judgment. Simply teaching a student how to obtain a weather briefing may not be enough. Ensuring that your student obtains a briefing before every flight develops good habits and emphasizes the importance of the weather check. Also, take time to discuss the conditions and require the student to arrive at a go, no-go decision. By ignoring a marginal forecast or continuing a flight in poor weather, you may be sending the message that checking the weather serves no practical purpose. Even if a flying lesson is canceled based on forecast conditions that never materialize, you have taught your student a lesson in judgment. You might not earn much for this particular lesson, but you can at least impress upon the student that it is better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were on the ground. A flight planning decision also played a part in Kevin's unfortunate incident. Kevin calculated total fuel burn for the trip based on a rule of thumb figure that his instructor had used during flight training. After reaching his destination, Kevin didn't request refueling. Based on his calculation, Kevin believed that sufficient fuel remained for the flight home. Students need to be taught to calculate fuel burn based on known conditions, using the performance charts in the pilot's operating handbook. An appropriate amount should be added to these figures to reach a conservative estimate and exceed regulatory minimums for VFR flight. By refueling at each destination on dual cross countries, you can illustrate the importance of never passing up a fuel stop. In addition, the fuel receipt can be used to calculate the actual aircraft fuel burn more accurately. Another way you can emphasize the importance of being fuel conscious is to set a minimum fuel limit for local flights. Stick to this limit even if you have no desire to wait for the fuel truck. Failing to recognize his own limitations was another factor that led Kevin one step closer to the unfortunate conclusion of his journey. In the presence of deteriorating weather, Kevin departed for the return flight home in the afternoon. Kevin didn't consider how fatigue and lack of extensive cross-country flying experience could affect his flight. You can help students realize that a relationship exists between personal limitations and safety of flight. If a student is feeling stressed, ill, or fatigued, suggest a ground lesson, shorten a flight, or reschedule a lesson.
For example, there are a lot of people who have come in and said, I've got the flu, or I have this problem or that problem, I'm not going to fly. And say, great, that's a good decision. We're using the FAA, I'm safe checklist, ill. Boop, that's it, we don't fly. So then there are other people that we've flown with, particularly when they don't like stalls.
They
and you
decide
say,
they're
that's right.
sick.
They decide they're sick. And then you go over and get your model airplane, work through the stalls and say, well, let's just go out and try some and see how they are. Because what it is just apprehension about not knowing what the airplane's doing.
Illustrate to students that personal limitations apply to all pilots by rescheduling flight lessons when you are sick and limiting your working hours each day to avoid fatigue. Although FAR 61.195 limits flight instruction to 8 hours within 24 consecutive hours, you may want to set a more restrictive personal limitation on both ground and flight instruction. The amount, type, and recency of flying experience is an additional factor to consider in the determination of personal limitations. Encourage students to schedule several lessons a week, and don't allow excessive time to elapse between lessons or solo flights without review. Placing appropriate solo limitations in a student pilot's logbook demonstrates the importance of gaining sufficient experience in specific flight conditions, such as crosswinds. As Kevin's flight continued, the weather along the route grew increasingly hazardous. Since the airplane's fuel supply was almost exhausted, Kevin no longer had the option of diverting to avoid rapidly developing thunderstorms. With few alternatives left, Kevin was forced to land at the nearest airfield available, a small private airport with one narrow dirt runway. Due to the gusty wind conditions and Kevin's limited experience, the approach and landing were difficult. After touchdown, Kevin lost directional control of the airplane and finally came to a stop in the grass several yards to the side of the runway.
So, is it true what the rumors I've been hearing?
If Kevin had been your former student, could the impression you made during flight training have prevented this incident? That's not an easy question to answer. Obviously, an instructor can't be responsible for every decision made by a student after the completion of training. However, you do have a responsibility to provide a positive example to your students regarding judgment and decision-making.
I think one of the biggest things that I found is that a lot of students didn't know what a practical test guide was. They didn't know what a PTS was, where I came up with the information, or where I came up with my tolerances. I felt my instructors prepared me well. They got me into the practical test standard guide right away. Also, they showed me the course syllabus, so I knew where I was going with my training.
So I have many applicants come in and they have no clue what's going to happen on the test because they haven't been reading the practical test standards or it hasn't been pushed onto them.
Now let's revisit our student pilots from the previous scenarios. Time has passed, training has progressed, and our story resumes as Jennifer and Matt prepare for the private pilot practical test. Upon returning from the final flight lesson, Steve and Jennifer set aside time to prepare the 87-10-1 Airman application for the practical test and to ensure that all the required logbook endorsements are made. An endorsement must be made certifying that the aeronautical knowledge requirements stated in FAR 61.105 and the flight proficiency standards of FAR 61.107 have been met. FAR 61.109 lists the aeronautical experience that Jennifer must have acquired during her flight training. In addition, FAR 61.39, which covers prerequisites for flight tests, requires an instructor endorsement certifying that the applicant has received flight instruction in preparation for the flight test within 60 days preceding the date of application. This endorsement also states that the applicant is competent to pass the test and has satisfactory knowledge of the FAA test subject areas in which the applicant was deficient. While preparing Jennifer for the check ride, Steve has been referring frequently to the private pilot practical test standards and required that Jennifer obtain a copy of the PTS at the beginning of training. Students as well as instructors should obtain an appropriate PTS to use as a reference throughout training, since it lists required maneuvers and procedures and defines the tolerances to which they will be performed. Jennifer has tabulated her flight time and filled out a copy of the 87-10-1 form FAA Airman Certificate and/or rating application. To guarantee that all requirements have been met, Steve also totals the flight time and refers to Jennifer's application copy to complete the form that Jennifer will furnish for the practical test. Now let's focus our attention on Matt, who has just returned from a local solo flight. An examination of Matt's logbook reveals that over 90 days have passed since Matt's first solo flight, and Karen has overlooked providing an additional solo endorsement. However, Karen endorsed Matt's logbook for the practical test, signed a blank application, and then departed on a trip for 2 weeks. Matt has been instructed to schedule any additional solo flights needed, add up his flight time, and complete the 87-10-1 form prior to the check ride. Matt's practical test is scheduled for the same day as Jennifer's check ride. And finally, the day of reckoning has arrived, the private pilot practical test. It's a perfect day for a check ride, but the FAA designated examiner discovers numerous errors on Matt's application, and a quick logbook check exposes some serious training oversights. For one thing, only 2.5 hours of dual flight time has been logged within the last 60 days. FAR 61.109 requires 3 hours within 60 days prior to the practical test. An additional error reveals that only 18.3 hours of solo flight time has been logged. This is 1.7 short of the 20 hours required by FAR 61.109. Before the practical test has a chance to begin, Matt is disqualified. Still, if the check ride could have continued, Matt's chances of passing would have been marginal because he lacked recent flight experience. On the other hand, Jennifer, prepared and qualified for the check ride, will become a private pilot today. These scenarios provide a vivid illustration of the consequences of meeting or failing to meet our responsibilities. Although student pilots may require extra supervision, the examples that we have explored apply to all pilot training, from primary to advanced instruction. We have a responsibility to supervise training, comply with regulatory requirements, and provide a positive example to all of our students, regardless of experience level.
I remember having some trouble with my landings, and my instructor, I had a woman at the time, and she kept suggesting that I hold it off, and I'd slam it into the ground. And one day I got it, and then I knew what she meant when she was saying, hold it off, hold it off. And she said, what could I have said differently? And I said, well, nothing. Now that I have it, it makes sense to me. But I think it's real important in teaching that you fashion what you're saying to the person you're saying it to, and maybe not have a standard way of presenting the information, but customizing it so it's relevant for who you're speaking to.
You're probably curious as to whether Matt eventually became a private pilot. Matt finally passed the check ride and received his private pilot certificate. Prior to beginning training for an instrument rating, Matt decided to assume some responsibility for his training. And not surprisingly, Matt chose Steve as his next instructor.